Welcome after a short break to a new episode in the Mike Oldfield podcast. I'm joined here by Markus Reuter. I'm Tobias Fischer. And in this episode, we'll take a look at Mike's album Incantations. Possibly one of his, let's say it's one of the albums where I think the divide between those who think it's his greatest work and who cannot stand it or cannot bear to listen to it is probably the biggest. Potentially. It's a huge work, a sprawling work, lots to talk about. At the same time, I think it's an album where I sometimes feel like talking leads nowhere sometimes with this album. It's potential. It opens up into so many directions. I sometimes feel a lot gets lost as soon as you start talking about it. But we'll see as we start on this episode.
Yeah, it's very much an album to listen to, and not to talk about.
in a way, and I guess that's also why, although it's so, I'm pretty sure that conceptually, if Mike were here and we'd sort of get him to agree to answer our questions, I'm pretty sure we could talk for hours and hours. I think it's very rich in terms of concept and theory and even the time when this was recorded. There would be so much to talk about, but he doesn't really. He's never really talked about it. When the remaster was offered to the public in 2011, he did do a few interviews, and I've listened to them. But there's not a lot of meat in there. There's really very, very little in terms of actual content about the album.
I mean, the only meat we have from him about it is in Changeling. There's a little bit of information about it there.
Yeah.
So there is the soundtrack to the film Reflection that has some kind of like early versions of sections of Incantations.
Yeah.
For that matter, also Woodhenge from Platinum is on there, and some variations of Omadon.
Yeah.
And so it kind of like, as you say, it spans, I would say, at least, what is it, 3 year period, right? So the longest up to that point, the longest he's ever had to work on something.
Yeah, and it is actually really filled with recordings for this album. It's not. He starts work in 1977, and then, as you say, parts of it come from a little bit earlier, and then it stretches on beyond the actual release of the album. So he's really filled an intense time of, and he has lots of other projects going on, which I'm sure in some way must have had an impact on the music as well. So it's an intense period.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, like if we talk about influences, it's First Excursion from the, what's the album called? Odyssey, right? By David Bedford. That's the theme. The theme of the album is kind of like right there. And also one of the riffs on side 3 of Incantations is the riff he plays at the end of Little Red Riding Hood on the Rock Bottom album, by Robert Wyatt.
Yeah.
So so you see there is sort of like some sort of like looking back, like recycling maybe older ideas in that album, but it's kind of much more conceptual and newly conceived as a whole thing somehow.
Maybe I will start off, I think, because when I started to prepare for this podcast episode, I took a piano on the side and I tried to play some stuff. And to be honest, I think even though I obviously have theoretical knowledge, I think in a way I was finding that there were so many questions I simply couldn't answer myself. So so maybe we'll start out by me asking you a few questions and get some answers for anyone who's interested in what's actually happening musically here. Maybe just one thing I wanted to state in the beginning is that I feel sometimes the album is presented as the end of a chapter. Mike Oldfield himself has sort of referred to it as the end of a chapter. I think that's slightly unfair, because to me it is also the beginning of something new. As you said, there are parts of it which appear on later albums. There are, and I think importantly, there are certain techniques he starts exploring on the album. There's an interesting German TV piece of reportage where he talks about the album, and he's seen behind his mixing desk. So that's one thing. He's behind the mixing desk, and he says of himself at the end of that very short interview section, "I'm really an engineer and a producer." And to me, that's what I feel about the album as well. I think it's a masterpiece of engineering. It sounds amazing still today.
Yes.
Even though I'm sometimes critical of the sound of the early albums, this one sounds fantastic, and it's one of those where the remaster really doesn't add. It doesn't really detract, but it doesn't really add anything. It sounds fantastic in its early stage, and the editing on this is insanely good. We know there's a few albums from the 70s where the editing process sort of broke the band almost apart, like Steely Dan. I'm not sure how many hours went into this and how it was exactly done, but it's really, really, I don't know. To me, it feels like he's exploring some of the techniques which will later come to inform something like Amarok, where it's really editing.
Yeah.
Editing.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so maybe the simplest question of all, musically, what is happening on Incantations?
The simplest question of all.
Yeah, the question itself is simple. The answer may not be.
So he's doing something really, really, really cool that actually requires an understanding of music that is sort of like how should I say, like an alternative path of music theory that is not really taught much, right? So what that means is that, like, normal music theory is pretty much based on the functional harmony. So the idea that there's tension and resolution, and like the dominant chord is sort of a very dominant topic.
Yeah.
And the funny thing though is that in Mike Oldfield's work, there's like in his whole work, there's maybe one dominant chord. like with dominant seventh chord, I mean. Like he doesn't use that. And Incantations is sort of like the extreme of not using the functional harmony the way it is kind of has been used ever since kind of like we know there is actually a record of things, right? So he's kind of keeps moving around the circle of fifth in both directions, and the chord, like at the very beginning, we hear this layered chord, which is, it's basically going fifth up, major second down, fifth up, major second down, like that, and that gives the chord, and that gives an extract of a diatonic scale, but spread out across some octaves. So
just for reference for the listeners, you're referring to the vocal.
Yes, at the very beginning, the vocal stack, and that's the chord. So it's not a standard triad that is being used on this record, but it's that very chord. So it's a minor sounding chord, but doesn't really have to be minor. It only gets like to the, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Only the seventh note is the third in the chord, in the sequence of the notes as they appear in the chord. And so it's really it's really interesting, because by kind of like restricting, by moving around the circle of fifth and by restricting himself to 5, 6 notes, not all 7 notes of the diatonic scale, things get very ambiguous. So you could, for example, change the bass note to be the fifth from where you are, and it would sound like you're in a different key, but the top structure, let's say the notes happening on top, could still be the same. And he does that throughout the album, where he kind of like plays with this kind of crazy way of using inversions, where he's using like the root notes that are being played on the bass, or sometimes the root, or sometimes the third, or sometimes the fifth. And these kind of like say arrangements of the basic progression is also done in a mathematical way. So there's always some sort of pattern to how the musical material is treated. And so each of the sections of incantations, like each incantation, I don't know if that's how we thought about it, but like each section is just its own little musical world, kind of based on in terms of composition on minimal principles, like minimal composition would work, minimal music from the time, but to maximum effect because of the use of this rich harmony, and the fact that it's not stuck in one place and in one key, but it can move around. And so this, what I just said, that there's sort of like an overlap between the notes that are being used for chord and in a melody with the adjacent two keys on the circle, everything can kind of like move back and forth, or just, mostly in one direction actually. And we don't really have the feeling of ever getting to a chord that needs to be resolved, because it keeps moving forward, right? And that's the most amazing and the most amazing feature of this. Also, in the melodic writing, the melodies that are used, the melodies are referencing the stack of notes more than they do any musical consideration in terms of like, is this note that is the melody actually a note that's in the chord? Like in most other music, again, it's this idea of consonance and dissonance. And he kind of like just simply takes that one drony chord, and the drony chord, and like choosing notes from that chord kind of like is the rule for how the melodies are being composed. So there are most famously the Hiawatha section at the end of part 2, and the whatever it's called, the Cynthia section, I think at the very last section on part 4, they have the exact same melody but completely different harmonization. And so it doesn't, and there you see, so the melody is just the melody, and you could put any chord under it. And that's sort of like, so basically on the harmonic level, on the progression of the harmonies, and the melodic level, and also on the rhythmic level, this is sort of like his most daring up to that point. Like the very beginning, the first theme is like alternating bars of 5/8 and 6/8, so it's an 11/8 thing. And on side 4, he has like the most complex rhythmic structure in the vibraphone canon that he's ever composed. Yeah, and that's also the most worked out sort of conceptual, in inverted commas, algorithmic composition he's ever done.
He describes in the book that he's actually, for this one, he actually sat down. He had an idea what he wanted to do. He wanted to use the circle of fifth, and then he sat down and wrote down some ideas. We will probably never know what exactly he wrote down at that point. We do know that he did some improvisations, which he also recorded, which this was drawn from. But in terms of what the starting point was, what do you suppose it was? Was it something like this, the conceptual side?
In the Knepworth live video, he plays a little bit of acoustic guitar and electric guitar at the beginning, or in between the performances, I think, in his studio, and he plays the theme of Incantations when he's talking about Guilty, because Guilty is utilizing that very chord, right? So and he plays it, and I think that's sort of like the way he plays it, simply by barring the full guitar, which is tuned in fourth, like the fourth is in the inversion of the fifth. So the guitar, and he basically frets a chord that's just fourths, and so that's sort of like what he's doing. So he's fretting, he's barring the full chord, and then he adds with the third finger, he adds the fifth in between. So it's and at that time, like the fourth harmony, like it's a jazz thing. Again, and in jazz, the stacked fourths, they would be used sort of like in a way that then again kind of like adheres to the system of dominant seventh sounds and stuff like that, right? So tritone relationships and stuff, and in Incantations, that interval basically is sort of taboo, because he never goes to the seventh note. The seventh note around the circular fifth is the tritone, so the opposite side of the circle, right? And he doesn't go there, and that gives him these options to actually, as I say, to like kaleidoscopically move around the circular fifth.
And of course, in a way, it doesn't resolve, but it comes back full circle at some point. And then
the coolest thing is that it actually does not resolve. If you listen to the last chord at the end of side 4, it's that very chord doesn't resolve. So the interesting thing is that I think on the album version, it's not as effective as I'm sure he wanted it to be. But there's the exposed double album, live album, and the very ending there, like, actually has that unresolved hovering kind of feel that the record doesn't achieve, but in the live version has that. And there is the interesting thing is that you could say there's no resolution, right? Or you could say it's a constant resolution.
Yes, I think probably this the conclusion I'll come to at the end of this, why I think it's so great, is that it's sort of one of the pieces which juggles opposites. You know, it's about it has lots of opposites, and I think, to me, that is the incantation part of it, is that it achieves things which are not possible in a way, because some things are clearly mutually exclusive, and yet they happen here in the same piece of music.
What do you mean?
For example, one thing is that the idea of constant change, and still the idea of not changing. The idea
static arrangements.
Yes, stasis and change, yes.
I agree, yeah. But that's very much sort of, in a way, just an extension of what he did with the very beginning of Tubular Bells, where people say, oh, it's like a minimal music motif, right? And already then, really, like the fact that he moves the chord between the A minor and the G major in the beginning of Tubular Bells, the back and forth, that then goes, further to become a 4-bar sequence. And in a way, he does that here, where he takes something that, again, you could see as a little, like a motif for a minimal music composition, but then the sort of like, let's call it theory knowledge that's in it, like that you can move these around and keep the bass notes constant is sort of a feature to kind of like blow up the idea of minimal music. So it is minimal music, but it's treated in a new way, in a different way, and in a way that has not really ever become popular with other composers. And so that's why sometimes for me it's sort of it's not a minimal music, it's a max music.
I think he's looked, I mean, we have to be honest about this. Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich was composed between 1974 and 1976 and was released for the first time on record by ECM in 1978. So, and then actually in Changeling, he writes, I recorded a string section with an ensemble of about 18 musicians. He actually writes that in the book. So what does that mean, about 18 musicians? Either there were 18 or there weren't. So clearly this in his book is a reference. I don't know if there were 18 string players on the album. I find it somewhat bizarre that there is actually no mention of who's playing the strings. It just says David Bedford, conductor. Doesn't actually say who's playing. But to say there were about 18 musicians playing these strings, which are the obvious reference to the Reich piece, to me indicates there's a nod to him. But there's a huge difference in the way that Music for 18 Musicians deals with this. I mean, to me, it's clear that there's a far more, well, I'm going to say musical idea of working with a pulse here, whereas with Reich it's often either psychoacoustic, which it is not in this piece, or it's conceptual, which I don't think it's either here. And he's, I think, one of the things which I find very noticeable in his use of the sequences is the constant breath. So I think every element of the sequence is constantly jumping in octaves, and there's a lot of upward and then going down, upward, going down.
That's the fifth as
Okay,
well.
yeah.
So in the microscopic way, let's say it's fifth, but also in the macro, or in the big picture, we have these movements of fifth. Yeah.
And that creates the sort of a breath, whereas in music for 80 musicians, it creates this this flickering, this shimmer.
The shimmer, yes, yeah, and the cool thing is also, I think I mentioned that before, that one of the things that Mike does is he's layering different subdivisions on top of each other. So, which is really rare in pop music or rock music, So, and then in Tubular Bells, it's a lot of like 3 against 4, you would call it, right? Also, then later on in like really the beginning of Platinum has like the whole Airborne, the whole section has this wacky feel. So in Incantations, what he does is that there is this theme or played on or actually sequenced, I guess, on a synthesizer, which is just the, and that is actually, I think it's 5 notes, right? So it's a 5-note pattern that he kind of like fits into a 6/8 bar or in a whatever, like it's kind of like floating on top. And for me, the funny thing is that this theme sort of like represents water. And in Sally Oldfield's album, Water Bearer, like that, you find that theme.
That is from that time, isn't it?
It's from that time. So it's I think Water Bearer was maybe released in 1980.
Yeah,
or so. I don't know exactly. We'll have to look it up. But anyway, it's really kind of like compositionally rich, and there's this infamous, I'm just gonna say it now, not later in this talk. So the trumpet duo, let's call it, on the record, right, which in the live version is a it's a duo of electric guitar and trumpet.
Yes.
That melody like reappears at the beginning of side 2, but it's backwards. So if you like take your audio editor and you load them in and you reverse the wave file and you listen, you get that melody. And I mean, this is just so fucking cool, I have to say.
But it's composed, right?
It's composed. Yeah. I mean, like it's composed, but maybe he found it by reversing the tape and then playing along.
Could be.
Yeah, because it's really hard to imagine what a melody would sound like backwards. Yeah. And I know that he's done stuff like that in other places. Like I guess there are a lot of things that we have not yet discovered about his work. Like because as a composer, that's sort of like the exciting part to find ways to almost like to transform, to mutate your own music into something new. And just this fact of like okay, it's that same melody but backwards, and it's like it's going through the circle of fifth, but now obviously it has to go in the other direction and stuff like that, and it's just fascinating. And in the studio recording, it's played on a flute synth kind of sound.
It's very, very hard to say. There are only 3 synths on the album. Very, very little electronic instruments. I'm surprised. I was surprised. I would have expected more. I think they take on a very prominent position, but it's very hard to say what is actually playing what.
It's also doubled, and sometimes it's doubled. I mean...
and you're probably right that I think maybe he had some ideas in the editing process. Ultimately, I think a lot of it is really played and composed. I said editing is very, very good. But then there are actually different sections when you watch it back in the live performances. They actually play them that way, so it sounds almost like there's a hard cut, and probably in the studio there was a hard cut.
Yeah.
But it's never a cut which is completely artificial, because it's always a cut which you can actually play for real.
Yes.
That is what makes it so
so
interesting.
Yeah. And that was sort of like sometimes when I'm hearing people's critiques of Mike Oldfield's music, is that they say that it's just a collection of parts that have nothing to do with each other. The people that say that they have simply have no idea what they're talking about. And even though, like in the studio, in the recording process, they may have like stitched together, yes, and you can hear that sometimes if it's not great. But I don't think that was ever like sort of like a real consideration. Like on Taurus 2, which is just such an amazing piece, for example, like you hear edits, but still they are composed. I mean, it's the composition, right? It's like more of the textural change that makes for where you kind of realize, okay, this is spliced, right? But on Incantations, because of the more or less constant orchestration, not obviously like you would only have the strings on parts 1 and 2, but nothing on 3 and 4, I think. I hope I'm right here.
I think so.
Yeah. And so there you can see there's also clearly sort of within the album, it's 4 sides, right? Like for those who don't know, there's also like each side has its sound world somehow, but then all the sound worlds are obviously related because it's based on the same compositional principle.
It's the whole is split into different parts, and each part contains the whole in a way. That is what the magic also is part of the album.
Yeah. And you know, there's one section which is the penultimate section in part 4. It's the original version of it is had a lyric, which is "Make way for the strange ones" is the lyric, and so it's and I think it's probably on the Reflection soundtrack. And it's just such a wonderful sort of because like you could say, okay, so this is a very like restricted kind of like conceptual composition, but then there are moments where it really feels like totally like something that comes right out of Omadon in a way, out of this freer expression, like intuitive composition rather than conceptual. But then you realize if you're looking at it closer, then that chord sequence is the implied chord sequence under the Hiawatha section, which really is not on the record. But then if you hear live versions, sometimes you hear like Pekka Pohjola playing those root notes in the background. So really a lot of kind of like information about like the origin of these themes and their interrelationship. You really only get it if you're comparing even different versions.
And that is, of course, the great thing is that the therapy happens in between recording Incantations, and then he goes out and plays it, and suddenly, for just a very brief window of time, we can actually see his process. We can actually see it's everything we didn't know before in the first 3 albums, where he doesn't go out and play, where he refuses to perform live. Now suddenly we can see, because there are actually in the live versions, there are fantastic guitar parts which add to the music at places where I'd never have expected them.
Yes.
And I mean, they don't. It doesn't mean the record is lesser in any way, or the live version is better. But it's fascinating to see, because he said he threw away a lot of music as well. I'm sure some of that, what he threw away, as we know, as he sometimes does, would probably have been fantastic as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the exposed version, the live version, is really incredible, because sort of like it's sonically and mood-wise, it is more coherent than the studio record for sure. Obviously, because it's played, right? And it had to be some editing, because like couldn't play the whole hour and 10 minutes or something. And so what's happening is that some of the key moments of the live recording, of the studio recording, are not there. Right? So the long guitar solo in the third part, for example, right? And it kind of like makes it more focused, is what some people say. But I would say it's just for me, it's almost like a different piece of music.
Because I agree. Because it's so in terms of mood as well.
Yes. And I mean, the studio recording, I absolutely love it. And like, here's some background for you. Like, when I bought my first CD in '87, I think, and it was Incantations, '86 maybe. And I didn't have a CD player, but the neighbor had a CD player, and the CD player copied the CD onto a tape that I listened to with my Walkman. And so I remember being in my bed and listening to Incantations, and I memorized everything. I memorized the patterns of the panning, because like Mike is very particular with where things happen and the stereo feel and stuff. And I followed all the instruments, and in my head I had all the patterns of the production choices laid out and stuff. Because back then I didn't really know enough about the music theory to understand what was going on. Like, I always had the sense something really special is going on, but I didn't know what it was, right? So, but I was able to kind of like map out the panning of the parts and stuff like that. And
why didn't you buy the tape in the first place?
Because I had the vinyl, right? And so I was aware that I sort of understood what digital media was already. So I knew that, okay, it wouldn't have the crackles, right? And it would have like a better sound quality than a tape. I knew that. So having a copy of the CD on tape was so much better than making a copy of the vinyl. And that's why. Okay. And like the second album I bought was Islands. That must have been a CD I bought was Islands in '87, and then I got a CD player.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's one thing I'm curious about. The melody of the opening melody of Part 1. That is such a. I mean, I think it's one of the incredible things about this piece of music is that this melody does not seem unnatural, even though it's really one of the most unique melodies I think I know.
Yes.
Do you think this is a melody which came? Would you say it's more conceptual of nature because it uses the pitches, or is it?
Yeah, it is totally that conceptual thing. So it's just the notes of that chord, of that you could say that construction principle of that chord is what he plays. That's the notes, and actually that's why I have to recommend the Networth video again. Like, he plays it there. So you can hear how he came up. You can see him play the beginning, the first measure of the melody. And then it alternates between phrases that go up and down. Right? Like, so the first measure goes up, the second measure goes down. It's an alternation of that. Also with these interesting, like the tags at the end of the melody, they are triplets. Again, which is this feature that he puts the triplet on the binary beat, a binary black background of stuff, and it's really great. But that's what it is. It's just a two bar phrase that is being shifted around, with according to the circle of fifth. And in the opening melody is sort of like just in inverted commas repetition of that theme for a few times. Yeah. Right. So it's purely flute, I think, at the beginning, and then it's kind of like a synth, and then it's like maybe synth and flute doubled. Can't even remember now exactly. There's also, like, obviously the live version that does it slightly differently, and it also in the live version it has the vibraphone in it, and I don't think it has that in the studio version, but I'm not 100% sure. But so what is really, like, when you want to talk about that melody, the opening melody, which is again just the arpeggiated chord. It's the last section of the studio of Part 1, the studio recording, which has the development of that theme. So where the melody is actually turned into a flute solo, and it's a written flute solo, probably worked out on guitar before. Or maybe he recorded it like half speed with a synthesizer or something, and then had somebody transcribe it, or maybe he wrote it with David Bedford. Like, I don't know. Like, it's all of these are possibilities, and he does these wonderfully amazing things where, as I said, it's a bar, like a total bar of 11 beats, right? That's in that section, but the flute plays sequences that are like in 4/4 on top of that, And then so he does all of these kind of like things that that kind of like composers, I would say most composers kind of like discover this way of writing with independent time signatures and independently shifting harmonic structures, let's say, at some point in their career. And that was that part in his career where he started experimenting with all these polyrhythms and sort of polymetric stuff, and it's really cool. And for me, that flute solo section, so the last 5 minutes of side of part one, is just incredible, and it's sort of the development of the melody. And not only some, but most of the variations that are created out of the melody appear in other parts of the album. So, for example, what I call the watery theme, that also the actual lead part, the flute plays it in that section, right? So you see like all these little elements, they are kind of not only sort of background elements or orchestrational or arrangement ideas, they are actual little motifs that he draws from, and so he uses them in parallel, and he uses them also linearly, and most famously for me in that flute solo section.
So maybe I can just ask this now, because the piece opens in F sharp.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed is that the dramatic moments of part 3 are in the same, or would have the same root note as the dramatic movement in Omadon, which is C sharp. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a significance in the fact that it's not in other pieces of it? So I compared, I took a look at some of that, but it's interesting to me that the real dramatic, the highlight of the intensity rises to its peak, are both in C sharp. In terms of functionality, I would say, is that a coincidence, or is there a sort of
So actually, if you could tell me what the last note of part 3 is, I could give you a good answer, because I don't know. So because as I say, if we talk about dominance, right? So even though everything is in minor, but C sharp would be the dominant of F sharp. Mm-hmm. So that's why maybe, because there's a slight of sort of like a resolution at the end of part 4, yes, where it's a surprise chord at the end, right? So we could call even that, we could call the surprise, we could call a resolution.
Yep.
So no, but I don't know. And this is the interesting thing. I really, because I have so much respect and love for this album, I did sometimes, I did kind of like transcribe things, but I never went into detail. Yep. I never really wanted to know all the secrets of this, because it's just so incredibly fascinating and beautiful.
I think we will. I agree. I think there is, and maybe also it happens in the moment, and when you look back, even if the composer looks back, who knows what was conscious or what comes from subconsciousness and what comes from the concept. Mm-hmm. What he does here is he sets up a space of possibilities. Mm-hmm. And then he plays and composes, and some of these things may not be intentional in the original meaning of that word or in the strict meaning of that word, but they're always a possibility. There's always the chance that something happens to this, and creating the chance is not coincidental. That is something which is intentional. And
you see, like it was good that you asked about this. The key center of the third part, right? Or the end of the third part. What is fascinating about the 4 parts is that they actually, we were talking about the editing before and putting the sections together, and it flows across the boundaries of the vinyl side, right? Yeah. So, and that is sort of like special to note as well, that even like the restriction there, and that's why you're probably right that Amarok is kind of like closely related, because Amarok fills the whole hour without a break. Mm-hmm. Because on CD you could do that, but on vinyl it was kind of like broken down into these sections.
Yeah.
But still, it's a flow. There's not, and in the live version, you can kind of hear that going from the first part into the second part, there's no break, and
Exactly,
also
yeah.
the third into the fourth, there's no break.
Yeah. And also interestingly, you mentioned Woodhenge before. I always thought that piece was sort of a odd piece on Platinum. It was. I loved it. I always thought, man, this should go on for longer. And probably if it had been part of Incantation, it might have gone on for longer, or maybe it would have gone into something else, and it would have felt completely at home on that album.
Yeah, and then like we could ask the question, okay, which part of Incantations would it have been part of?
Yes,
I think the fourth.
Yeah, probably. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of these to me these sections which have no ending, but then he manages to somehow integrate them into something which is about constant change. So yeah, and so we have a symmetry with the second part and the fourth part.
Hey, actually, and so the Woodhenge again, it also has the theme, the first excursion theme, which is like the first theme of part one that we're talking about. Actually, it has that in it. Woodhenge has that in it, and this is sort of like also in a way this Incantations theme is sort of an inversion of Omadon. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's like it's sort of like an inversion of that, And actually, in this is kind of interesting. In Exposed, in the Exposed record, live album, when he's playing the Tubular Bells, there is a moment where he's quoting Omadon over it in Tubular Bells in a solo, and it is really there. You get the total Incantations vibe. So it's really interesting, like.
Yeah, to me, if to me, Incantation sort of he said about it, he did not want to have it just be a part two, but he wanted to go over it. But to me, it's a summary of everything he's done and more. But there's so much of the other albums in there, but not in a trivial way, not in a quote way, but in a they feel like they've been woven into the structure of the music somehow.
You see, like this fact that he discovered this movement in fourth and fifth, and he incorporated that into guitar parts. You can still hear that on Platinum. You can hear that in the solo, the solo, like part two of Tubular Bells on Exposed, solo section, the E minor. Kind of what is like Rhodes and electric guitar, and then he plays that beautiful solo on top, and he goes into this incredible kind of like arpeggiated section, and again that is sort of like the same. That's the thing that he discovered while working on Incantations.
Yeah.
So you can see that these, and I mean it's great. I think it's great, like with him, that these discoveries he makes, he kind of like keeps them. He doesn't really keep milking them for more than two albums.
Yeah.
Again, then he kind of like changes the approach completely again. But yes, there's a lot that sort of like found its way into the live performance that actually comes from maybe even just simply because he had to practice the parts for Incantations, and so he became a better player.
Could be,
because it's an incredibly difficult thing to play, because the key changes every 2 seconds, right, on that album.
Yes, it's interesting that the classical musicians who were part of the performances were interviewed for a documentary, and they were all very positive about the music. They said it was good fun playing it, and that is very, very rare. I'm pretty sure, from experience and from what I would imagine, most classical musicians see these kind of gigs as a way to make easy money, at best.
I remember though that there was that they had some kind of sort of trouble, because obviously, like the tour for Incantations was the Exposed tour,
Yes.
right? And they had 55 people
Yes.
in the band.
In the band.
and like, I guess, and I mean, this is something, maybe let's go there again. So you talked about therapy, that Mike did therapy. Can you tell us more about that? Because, the fact that he went on tour and he went from like not wanting to go out to touring with 55 people, is kind of mood swingy, right? So, so what happened there in the...
Well, he, not to go into it too much, but essentially he went into therapy because he was in a bad place again during the recordings of the album, and the therapy exegesis was actually not quite unpopular. It was pretty popular at the time. It was well known, and he went in, had a friend of his go with him as support, and the therapy is about taking responsibility. I would say it is about admitting that you are responsible for who you are and where you are in life. That is supposedly also the idea. Well, it's one theory. The idea behind the title "Guilty," which he recorded after. After finishing Incantations, is the idea, well, if I'm feeling bad and if I'm in a bad place, then I'm guilty of being there, and I have to do something about it. And the theory itself consists of a few days of talking, and then in the final stages, you are sort of induced into a state of trance and release, and you admit, you allow yourself to express everything negative in yourself and to come out, and you become a child. You go back, become a child, and you are reborn into a different person without the negative ballast and luggage that you had before.
So it's a rebirth thing.
It's a rebirthing kind of thing, and it is ecstatic. It is horrifying, and then it's ecstatic, and it's an incredible release of energy, and it gives you an incredible amount of energy, and that's, I think, what was happening in the time directly after. And he describes it, and other people describe it. They couldn't actually place the person he was after therapy with the person before, and so he actually also, on the positive side of things, he goes out, he does interviews, he starts writing a different music, and despite statements made by close associates of his to the opposite, I think some of this music is incredible and some of the best he's ever written, precisely because he's now has a more positive mindset. But it does change him, and on maybe on the downside, on an impulse, he marries and then gets divorced again within 3 weeks. He also, I think well, the change in music also is maybe regrettable in a few other instances. I think it's maybe...
I don't think so. I think that's sort of like, people who say that are sort of arrogant. I mean, arrogant and kind of, I don't even want to say the word. Like if a person, makes a decision to kind of like try something else, or to change, or to, and kind of challenge.
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I think musically, it's just that people were not getting what they were expecting. And I think that's cool. If you're an artist who can do that, it's it's very, very cool.
I think, but the thing is more that I think that maybe what he did before was an important part of himself. Maybe we're lucky we even got 4 albums of this music. It's fantastic.
But that he himself said that he had a trouble finishing Incantations.
Oh yeah.
Because he didn't like it anymore. He didn't like the concept. Yeah. Halfway through, he didn't like it anymore, and it was a struggle to finish it. Yes. And I think you can hear that a little bit.
Maybe. It's interesting that if you look at the timeline, a lot of it was recorded afterwards. I was surprised. A lot of it was in terms of the sessions. Most of the musicians come in after the therapy, which is in June, and then I think up to December there are the sessions, and a lot of it is recorded then. And then of course he does and arranges everything himself. According to himself, he didn't musically. I think he just saw it through. Are there certain passages you think where you can tell maybe that it was a struggle to finish?
I think it's part three, which actually is sort of. I can't really say that because I love it so much, but it really has something slightly different about it. It's like conceptually, it's hard. I guess it was hard for him to pull it off in the recording studio because live it works beautifully, right? So I think that maybe the frustration or the difficulty wasn't so much with the composition, with the musical material, but with like how to make it work in a recorded, in the recording studio. And that's sort of like what I'm hearing there, where it sounds a little bit more plasticky for a reason. Like it's very dry and the drums sound kind of like, I do like it, but it's really particular.
It is very particular.
Yes.
The opening, the intro of part 3, is that a non sequitur? Do you have any idea where that?
Yeah, I think it's he lifted that melody and that section from somewhere. Because I think I've actually seen the score of like a piece from, I can't even remember, like 300, 400, 500 years old. I saw some notation so it was a quote from a composition that he must have heard somewhere.
He was listening to a lot of classical and sacred music.
Yes, and sort of. I think it's got to do a little bit, and like we talked about that a little bit. I think when we talked about Omadon, that he made less penning, and they played folk music together, and sort of like rearranged some tunes together, and so maybe during that time he found this like say medieval sounding kind of dance kind of music, but then it's sort of like so cool because it's mixed with the Incantations theme, and the Incantations theme, though there in that section, it's all major chords, so it's really cool. Kind of just a juxtaposition to part 1, really very much, right? And but I think like especially on the exposed version is really a fantastic realization of part 3.
Yeah.
And the groove, like with Pierre Moulin playing those drums, and the also like the melodies there, they don't seem to kind of like relate to the other melodies on the record. They're just so cool, and I mean there's also like the proggy thing, which has like changing time signatures in a unison, kind of like a unison way. Things he like really hardly ever does on any other record. It's just so cool. I mean, I love it, but still, it seems like I can see how the struggle may have been to make it work in the studio.
What I love about this is that he goes through these constant changes in the bass at first, and then when it comes to that moment I mentioned where he goes into C sharp,
yes,
he oscillates between 2, and then he goes back, and it's this stop and start, and then he locks in at the right moment, and it makes it all the more powerful, but it has a more fluent motion. It's not like an Omadon where you actually everything is building up to one climactic eruptive moment, but it's sort of it's flowing, and you go back, and then it goes back once more. A lot of guitarists seem to be incredibly impressed by the playing on this. Can you maybe tell what's so challenging or so difficult about this?
Okay, so first of all, it's like I said, it's changing key with every phrase.
Yeah.
Right, so that you're moving sort of moving a pattern, a scale or pattern around, which is difficult on guitar, especially if you go through all 12 keys, and the melodies, the phrases he's playing, they're totally not guitaristic. Like people would say, like there is a certain way to play guitar, things that lie easily under the fingers, and he just kind of like plays. The notes he has to play for these melodies are conceptual at first, and so he needed to work them out to play on guitar. And I'm sure there was a lot of splicing and putting it together in the studio. I mean, it was not played through all the way. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. And it's really just this variation, the variations, melodic and harmonic variations he does on the guitar. And also, it's not just one guitar. At some points, the guitar is harmonized with another guitar there, right? And so in a way, this section, the long guitar solo, is the equivalent to the end of part 1, where it's the flute playing on top of this. So, you know, it's sort of like the same thing, but different. Right.
I don't know if you've read this. I found this. I should quote this. I forgot to copy the quote, but there's a longer passage on the Mike Oldfield website where it says he bought specifically for this project a Gibson L6S. So he has all the guitars he had from his previous project. He buys the Gibson L6S, and apparently the main reason, this is a direct quote, for choosing the guitar was its neck, because of both the feel and the fact that the intonation was accurate right the way up to the 24th fret.
Yes, exactly. Because it has that very high E in it. And actually the funny thing is, like I think on Platinum, North Star,
yes,
so part 4 of Platinum, he plays the highest note he ever plays on a guitar, and apparently it's like he's fretting the note on the pickup.
That's
not on the fret. So I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of like what I heard. You know, because it's a high G or something, so it's really beyond what is available on a guitar.
Well, that is an incantation then.
Yeah, and so yes, makes total sense. You know, like intonation, incredibly important for incantations, because you want to play the same thing in all keys, right? And like guitars are not really known for being well tempered, right? So yeah.
I just had to think also, because we're talking about this particularly, that that this album arrived at the very sort of the moment that punk broke through, and he talks about this extensively. And it's there's the talk about Pink Floyd being the antithesis to punk, but really, I mean, this is the This really is, and that's I think that's also why. Maybe his hate towards punk, if we can call it that, but his deep loathing of punk maybe comes from, because it was so antithetical to what he was doing himself at this moment. I don't think it's actually true that that Virgin was actually trying to be a punk label, and history doesn't actually show that. They did sign the Sex Pistols, but really Virgin got their big commercial breakthrough after Tubular Bells with the new wave bands like Human League, and so punk was never commercially that interesting, and it lasted for 2 years maybe.
I mean, Simon Draper loved all sorts of music, and so it was really not about being anything in particular. I don't think so. And Simon Draper loved Mike Oldfield also when Incantations was released. Right. So I don't think that there was any bad intentions or kind of like even change in. It was just that they went with the flow, and they kind of like, you know, supported very different scenes.
Yeah.
And like, you know, I mean, like supporting Faust or like Tangerine Dream, and then like Tangerine Dream was successful, Faust wasn't, was dropped at the very beginning. Then like obviously they put out the Gong albums, and so I think, and I also, like, I mean, to be quite honest, like in the way that Mike has been presenting himself, like he never really presented himself, I don't think so, but so he kind of like got, you know, into this mode of following narratives, and maybe it was things that like maybe people suggested to him to talk about. From a marketing perspective, so it wasn't really so much what I don't think that he, as such a music lover, would actually have problem with punk. I think that it was like maybe not his thing, right? Okay, but I'm sure he just loves that people make music. What kind of like created the problem was that the media, if we want to call it that, sort of like made it harder for him to kind of like exist, because the focus was shifting on kind of like what was being promoted, what is cool.
Yeah.
And it's not that his cool was any less cool, his music was any less cool because somebody didn't call it cool anymore. But if you're kind of like getting sort of a little bit addicted to the dopamine hit of being successful, right? It can be very hard. So I see that as like the main thing. I really don't think that he has a problem with music.
The latter
that
part is
artists
super
make.
important, I'm sure. It's also, well, I did get to talk to Trevor Horn recently, something we'll get into in more depth in the podcast, because I actually managed to talk to him very briefly about Tubular Bells 2, and we'll try to get that section or that segment of my conversation into the podcast very soon. Trevor Horn was very, very strongly against punk, and his quote was essentially that punk was just badly produced rock music. But the interesting thing is,
And Trevor is a big fan of Incantations.
exactly, and he also told me that his favorite album is Incantations, and funnily enough, his favorite part of Incantations, which he actually singled out specifically without me having to ask him, is the end of the second movement.
Yes.
Which to many people is where that sort of separates the lovers and the haters.
Yes.
But Trevor Horn is so interesting. I think not to get into this too much, but one thing is interesting about this in conversation. I was expecting him to be someone who. So I asked him what is more important, but how do you see the balance between the song, the composition, and the arrangement? Mm-hmm. And I would assume that this conversation has been going on for ages, and you cannot resolve it, because in the ultimate, like in the ideal case, the two are inseparable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I would assume that producers, just because it's their expertise and their contribution, they would see how important the arrangement is, and they would maybe, just to balance it slightly more away from the composition, they would say it's the production. But Trevor Horn was always, he doesn't start producing before the song is done. Mm-hmm. So he actually, when he gets sent a song, the first thing he can hear whether or not it's promising, but he will then say, before we actually go into the studio, let's go take a piano or a guitar and work on the arrangement. Let's work on the song. Let's work on the lyrics. And I can see why that kind of mentality came into conflict with punk and everything it brought. Mm-hmm. And I could see like how if you compose something like Incantations and you spend 2 years or between 1.5 and 2 years in the studio and with writing and refining it to what it is and what it ends up to being, I can see how that is very different from that mentality and how it,
Yeah, and speaking of that again, so side one or part one and part two of Incantations with the string ensemble. Mm-hmm. First of all, the writing that I'm sure David Bedford did, like obviously the orchestration and the notation as well, is incredible. It's really just musically, harmonically. We already talked about like harmonically, like conceptually harmonically, but how it was kind of like put into reality, into sounds, is just so fascinating. And where part one is the fast movement and part two is the slow movement, in more general terms, and like the atmosphere is the sort of like also the idea of spreading out the sound so much. You have very high pitched string parts in part two, for example, and low, and then you have like the melody where you have like this timpani sound, which does this like 3/4 beat, and the melody on top, and 4/4, which is played on bass guitar and electric guitar, and but with the strings in the background, and like it's just so beautiful and so as you say, like it's sort of like really on the opposite spectrum of the of what was happening at the time. And like as you say, like we said, Mike kind of like attached himself more to the say contemporary classical or popular classical music of the time, which was, as you said, Steve Reich or Philip Glass, which like he ended up working with the people, Philip Glass, on the next record. So you could see that that's where his head was probably, right, at the time. And like, I mean, this is totally, I'm going to say it anyway. So you're asking, like, it's the album starts in F sharp, right? Starts with an F sharp. And it's funny, like the F sharp sort of represents on a keyboard the note that where you're going out of the system of the diatonic system, because all the white keys are there, and then like if you're doing like your stacked fifth starting on F, you end up on a B. That gives you the C major scale, or F Lydian for that matter, and then the next fifth, that would be the F sharp, and sort of in a way it has sort of like a symbolic meaning. I don't think that Mike ever thought about that, but sort of the F sharp is the symbol of stepping beyond.
Is it possibly also pretty much in the middle of the keyboard?
Exactly. Well, it's in the middle between C and C.
Of course, yes. Of course, that's always.
It's the tritone.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, exactly. So it's sort of like it stands for going beyond what is presented to you in diatonic music. So it's the one note, the first note in the circular fifth that goes beyond the white keys. Right. And so in so far it makes sense.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, I've always wondered, I mean, when I said at the beginning that I would like to ask you questions, it's because it always the discussions of the album always focus on the circular fifth, and they're saying, so he based the album on the circular fifth. I don't think that doesn't explain anything. But I do think that the circular fifth in a way is also a magical instrument, because it's a fairly new device in the history of music.
Yeah.
The whole idea of this perfect, regular intonation, not just intonation, but regular intonation, is new, and it's a sort of magic. It was unthinkable to the old Greeks when they tried to figure that out, that this could be done. But it's sort of you do something, and suddenly everything is aligned, and that is a sort of magic in itself. So maybe I think it's not a question so much of using the circular fifth for its own sake, but it's sort of the possibilities it opens up. It opens up a magical space. Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, like, and maybe we don't want people to get the wrong impression. It's not that the whole record is always the same movement around the circular fifth. Like he plays with that, and like most particularly, it's the Diana section, right, which happens both on part one and part two. Is really is fascinating, because he sort of plays with that freedom of changing, of moving freely around the circular fifth, but he doesn't do it in a patterny way anymore there. And so you have this melody, like again, like every phrase is in a new key, but it's not following any particular pattern. And I don't remember exactly the cycle. I think it's a 9-bar phrase. Again, so this is very Oldfield, right? So rather than having like an epic melody, like Tubular Bells finale, epic melody, 10 measures or something, I think, right? Yeah. And then I can't remember with Omadon, it's maybe 14 or something like that. And here now the Diana section is 3 times 3. And also represented in how even the words are kind of like treated as a pattern there, but the harmonic movement is not kind of like restricted to the circular fifth anymore. And just like to work with like odd time signatures is one thing. Like it's kind of boring. Like if you are a musician and you realize like somebody's just writing a piece in 5/4, it's boring, right? It's as restrictive as being in 4/4 or 3/4 or whatever, but coming to like being free and changing the length of of the phrase, that's where it gets interesting. So having a 9-bar melody is an incredibly cool thing, and this is where like the brain of the usual listener, coming back to the idea of incantations, is put into trance, because like you're expecting the melody to end after 8, like subconsciously expecting it to be 8 phrases long, and then there's a 9th phrase, which means that some people will hear the 9th phrase as the first phrase.
Yep.
You know, and so that's why some people may not even be getting or understanding what's happening, because you're overlaying your expectation of what the patterns and the phrases should be, and then it's not met with what's actually happening, and that's a good thing, because like it makes it very interesting, and it's something you can listen to for you know, your whole life. Like, you know, look at me.
Yes, and I mean, I actually have this effect even still today with the Tubular Bells opening sequence.
Mm-hmm.
I find it hard to determine with absolute certainty where it ends and begins once it started.
Yeah.
And I've gone back to it several times, and I'm still not sure if I can actually, even if I had the score in front of me, if I could actually feel it.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the feeling, and I suppose maybe that's why some people, as we discussed before we started recording, some people find it hard to listen through incantations, because it does put you in a state of float. It's a sort of a floating state, and it does it from both angles. So it does it through one where it keeps the sort of constant change, and then in the end of the second movement, it has this it achieves the same effect by having one chord in the background which doesn't change a single time throughout the entire length of that section.
Hey, there's actually some other link that we haven't mentioned. So the drums in the Hiawatha section, that's Jabula as well, the percussion group that played on at the end of Ramadan, right? And I read actually that Julian Bahula just died.
Yes, very sadly,
Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of like a link there. And then we didn't mention disco music at all, which was the time, right? 78.
Yeah.
That's like where there was still a huge explosion. So it wasn't only punk that kind of like happened, it was also disco. And Mike more so went to the disco direction. And you can hear like the octave bass kind of things in Incantations, and sort of the layering and the trance thing. That's also very much a technique that was used in disco music at the time.
Absolutely. And I'm glad he went to the disco direction, because some of the stuff he did where he does this fusion are incredible, and just it feels very natural. I think that is what interests me.
Mm-hmm.
It feels very natural, not at all forced. Not sure about the Taurus 2 thing on 5 Miles Out. That is a question of taste, I suppose, where we also have sort of a disco beat. But on Guilty, I think it's amazing. I think always thought that was incredible.
And I think we mentioned this, or I mentioned this before in this series, that the deluxe edition of Incantations has this piano improvisation on it, which is sort of the themes of Platinum and Guilty in one little piano piece.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's why I was saying I think it isn't so much the end of something, it's really the beginning of something as well.
There's the piece Pipe Tune that was released, which, well, so I can't even remember, must have been a B-side or something, which has the sort of like the B section of that piece Pipe Tune is the beginning of part 4 of Incantations. So it's the lifted that theme for another piece of music, but there's a different melody, the pipe melody. And there's another little demo in the deluxe edition there where Mike actually plays the pipes, the bagpipes. So he wanted to learn at that time to learn to play bagpipes.
Yeah, it took him a year, I think he said.
Yeah. But then on Incantations there are no bagpipes, interestingly enough. Yeah. But at that time, he was kind of like working on that. I think it's just so cool. I mean, you know that he's my hero in so many ways. But how cool is that? That you actually kind of like, I mean, it was the time before we had all these distractions, right? Distractions.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to listen to it with the ears of someone, for me, who grew up with all of these technical possibilities at musicians' disposal. I think we often forget how great some of the musicians were at a time when you couldn't just you could splice it together with tape. That was established, but it was a lot more work intense, and you wouldn't just do that. For example, the marimba canon, vibraphone canon. I actually expected that one to be edited, but it's not. They're just playing it live. I'm pretty sure. It sounded to me like it was edited because it's so close. They're really. I don't know. And then you see it and play it live, and it's just they're just playing it.
Yeah, that's the most fascinating part of the whole composition of Incantations. Where, remember what I said, that there's like an ascending bar measure of the melody and a descending.
Yeah.
And so here he basically shifts one of the vibraphones, and he says that it was an accident on tape. I don't believe him. Maybe it's true. I don't know. But anyway, so he's putting the canon part, the vibraphone part, or the melody into canon with itself, and it's also this section where I said where the cycle is, the rhythmic cycle is very complex, where he drops one beat from the 11 every 8 bars or something. So it's rather than being 8 times 11, which would be 88, it's actually 87, because like one beat is dropped there, and it's again with this disco kind of bass under it, like with these octaves, right, with the accent on the offbeats, right, and it's so cool. And that's also the section where you have the vibraphone canon running, and then you have this, what I said earlier, where the bass notes kind of like sometimes they are the third, sometimes they are the root, sometimes they are the fifth. And it's just so fascinating. And on top of that 87 sort of like cycle or whatever it is, can't remember now exactly. He's putting a percussion part in 4/4.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the choo 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 with like sleigh bells or whatever it is on top of that, and it's so cool.
And I love about the canon is that because it's 2 parts which are played by the same instrument, it's hard to separate them. I really tried to listen to or hear the individual lines, but it's very, very hard.
Yeah. And now it comes. Now it comes. The overlapping parts of the canon, they make in the middle, you could say, they meet and make a melody. And that's the melody he plays on the guitar on top of it all. So that's so cool.
Yeah, that is pretty great.
Yes. And this is something that's particularly noticeable in the live version, where at the end of that melody on the guitar, he just plays like 1 note per measure, and it goes up in whole steps. So it kind of covering the whole tone scale on top of the movement, which is in 5th, which is so it's kind of like it's really really beautifully conceived and highly complex, and still so listenable, just so inviting and enchanting and beautiful.
Yeah. And also this this way of composing. One thing I notice in many of his pieces is that he uses upwards and downwards movement in other pieces where it's not that pronounced, but he likes to use it to denote change, or for example the ending or something, or mood, and I think the great thing is that sort of you can almost create sections where the melody keeps going down all the time, which would have been impossible, because like if you stay within one key, it reaches a natural end.
Yes.
But the way, because he's going constant jumping between root notes, you can actually keep going down and down and down and down, and you stay within the mood or the signaling of that movement.
Exactly. Yeah, it's this idea to use the interval and the inversion of the interval, and that way you can kind of like navigate, and it gives that feeling of a constantly descending or ascending part. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I know that there are a lot of things we haven't talked about. For example, and maybe you remember that better than I from the autobiography, that he went and talked to people about, who wanted to find texts, lyrics to use, or a text to actually use on the record, and ended up using the Song of Hiawatha by Longfellow, right? And then what's it, Ben Jonson, the hymn to Diana, it's actually called, but.
Yeah, Diana comes up repeatedly, and then he marries Diana, which is also a nice incantational.
Really? Okay. Yeah, but sort of like the fact that he kind of like did want to find people that sort of are kind of like spiritual, but not necessarily religious, or like, and he was put off. Like, I think in the autobiography it says he was put off by quite a few of the people he tried to meet to give him like these interesting lyrics, so that he didn't end up using.
Yes, that was the original plan. Yeah, he doesn't actually mention too much. He just the episodes where he gets to meet shamans and druids and shamans and druids don't feel. I know in one case, one woman actually doesn't say a single word, so that was of course not particularly fruitful. Another tries to convert him to Druidism. I like the effort though. I think it's very easy to do research these days, and you just go online and seek out sources and videos, and but he actually meets these people. I think that's a step beyond your usual research process.
Yeah, I agree.
By the way, the Jabula sections, I'm at least on paper, he did go into the studio with them. I just thought they were so close to the Omadon stuff. Do you think it could have been leftovers?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's very possible.
I was reminded,
and it's also used like a sample.
Yes.
Remember that we said that on Omadon, it's like there may be some loops, drum loops.
Yeah.
And so I think it may be a leftover. Yes.
Because he played for them during the Omadon sessions for hours and hours. And I was reminded of the way they sound on Incantations is similar to how the drums sound on Return to Omadon.
And because that's also a sample.
Yeah.
And also on Amarok. It's also sampled in Amarok. Also, like the interesting thing is that the boran, that percussion instrument, also kind of like starts making more of an appearance here, where it was. I think he must have used it before on his singles, right? But here it makes an appearance already in Omadon, obviously. But here in part 4, you have these kind of grooves with the boran, with like hitting the frame, so getting that wooden clicky kind of sound and stuff. And in a way, the Hiawatha, like Jabula section, there is really it's a different sound, but in a way, like, this is what I love about it. It's sort of like mingles. You could say, it's the same kind of rhythm but different instruments. And so here it's like an Irish drum, there it's like an African drum, and I love how that kind of like gets mixed up in his style. Actually, there is a piece called Song for Survival that he did for his daughter, because his daughter was kind of part of a film team that did visit tribes in the Amazon. And so I don't know if you know this piece at all. So it's like a 3-minute piece, and it's incredible. You could tell it was just produced in like 30 minutes or something. Like, not much care went into it, but it's based on a sample of a tribe singing a melody, an Amazon tribe singing a melody. And so, but what he does is kind of like starts it with like synthetic percussion, and like, so like it could be like what happens like in the first 2 minutes is like a song that could have been on Voyager or something like that. So him playing the Strat with a very clean sound, playing this beautiful melody, and you could say it could be like an Irish melody or whatever. And then he stops, and then I'm getting goosebumps now. And then the native tribe from the Amazon sings, and it's that melody.
Wow.
It's so incredible. Like, and then there's like a brief moment where he plays with them. And it's just so moving, and like this effect of this world music kind of like this whole, I would call it whole world music. It's not a world music. It's not specific to a, but like where the music he does sort of like represents sort of like the essence somehow of music, and it's still fascinating to me.
So maybe this is a good point to make sure that the this podcast doesn't get as long as the actual music.
Well, it already is, but we'll see.
That point.
But there's still a lot that could be said.
Yes,
this is like important to point out, and I do really recommend to check it out and to listen to the studio album, obviously, but also to the real exposed version. So you have to hunt down the album version, because there is also a DVD called Exposed, which is a different version. So it's got to be the version that Mike remixed after, from the live tapes.
And it's also, I think, to me, one of the deluxe editions, which is extremely valuable, because the pieces, the bonus material, is not just historically interesting, it's actually different takes on sections from the album, and which shed a new light on it.
And he made a remix of the Diana section, which is actually pretty cool. Yeah. And
some of the disco stuff suddenly sounds almost like Tangerine Dream could have sounded like. Very, very interesting.
Yes.
I think, when I listened back to it, it was really, I talked about this constant opposites and the unifying of different things.
Yeah.
I think why I love it so much is that human life is finite, but music in its best moments can sort of give us a glimpse or a feeling of the infinite. And this music does that, I think. That's why I think I can dive in at any point. It doesn't have to be the beginning. You can take out any movement, or you can dive in at part 2.
Yes. And it's sort of like this circle of fifth, and the whole record, the 4 parts are like a cycle, like a circle, and you can start from the beginning, and you get you can listen to it endlessly on repeat. Okay.
So thanks, this was great. And next one would be Platinum, but we'll also see if we can get the Trevor Horn thing up. And
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe to those who've been listening, I've also put out a conversation with Anthony Glynn, talking a lot about Mike Oldfield. So, if you want to check that out on the Markus Reuter podcast. And we're trying to get we didn't originally plan to have guests or but as we kind of move forward with this, maybe we'll get to talk a few people who were involved. Yeah. So anyway, thank you for listening, and until next time.
Bye-bye.